As you know, AQA gives you two questions to choose from for an inspector calls. The first one is a character question and the second one is a theme question. Now, how do I turn the character question into an answer that's going to get me top grades? The way to do that is to write about Priestley's ideas. His ideas are where grade 7 and above are. So my prediction for 2025 is that the character will be Gerald. At the end of the video, I'm going to link to my theme prediction in case Gerald doesn't come up. Why would I do that for you? Well, the theme is always the same. You can change the words of the theme question as much as you like, but it's always about social responsibility, no matter what the question. So we're going to look at Gerald from the point of view of social responsibility. And if you're really excited about the essay that I model for you during this video, you can get an actual copy of it using the link in the description. So we're going to start with the thesis statement. The thesis statement is more than an introduction. It says to the examiner, this is why Priestley has constructed Gerald. This is what Gerald is for, and he is for these three things. Number one, he represents the wealthy capitalist males, like Burling, who are exploiting their workers like Eva. So he represents the capitalist class in society. Next, he represents sexual exploitation in two ways. The first way is he exploits Eva's poverty in order to essentially set her up as his mistress for very little cost. The other way that he is exploiting women is he expects Sheila to put up with this, because that is the social norm of patriarchal society. Regular viewers will know those two words, patriarchal society, immediately push you up into grade 7, 8 and 9. Then there is a third reason which you probably haven't been taught, but will make sense to you when you think about the inspector's final words about the lesson being taught in fire and blood and anguish. What is he on about? He's on about World War. And what he's trying to say is, listen, if the Burlings had learnt their lesson in 1912, therefore society would have learnt their lesson in 1912, we would not have had a world war. What he's saying is these people stayed in power. So when we get to the end of the play, who is going to take over? Gerald is. He is the young inheritor of Crofts. Eric is the young inheritor of Burlings. These are the people in the interwar years who are going to make the difference to society. And Priestley's point is they don't make any difference to society. They keep society the same, which is why we get a Second World War. Let's see what that would look like in writing, because that sounded complicated and it ain't. Here we go. Priestley constructs that word that examiners love, Gerald, to represent the powerful class of capitalist men who damage society by exploiting the working class. Explanation number one. He also represents the sexual exploitation of poor women and privileged women in society through his relationships with Eva and Sheila. Second explanation. Finally, he explains why men of his class refused to learn the lessons of World War I and repeated the fire and blood and anguish of World War II. Three explanations. I've whacked a quote in there, which you don't normally do in a thesis statement, but hey, if you can, why not do it? My essay now becomes an argument that proves these things. Already, the examiner is expecting to give me a grade 8 or 9 because I've dealt with Priestley's ideas, not just 1, not just 2, but 3. The examiner is dazzled by your brilliance and is already looking for reasons to give you top marks. Okay, here are the 14 quotes for your essay. Do you need all 14? No, you don't. The average top grade essay, grade 9 or even 30 out of 30, has 13 quotes in them. Let me show you how to use them in your argument. At number 1, we've got Mrs. Burling's words. You'll have to get used to that just as I had. She says to Sheila, how's that about Gerald? Well, Mrs. Burling is saying to Sheila, look, your dad, Arthur Burling, he used to be away for work a lot. I had to get used to it. This is a coded message. It means your father used to have affairs. That is what men do in our society. We don't just have to put up with it, we have to excuse it. It's normal. That's just the way powerful men are. If you want to marry one, and you do, you're just going to have to put up with it. That is shocking, but it is how the patriarchal society works, and it's going to help explain the ending. Stick around to my last quote to find out what I mean. At number 2, Gerald diffuses this whole suspicion that Sheila has about what he was doing last summer by producing the engagement ring. What does Mrs. Burling say? Not, oh, how wonderful, you're going to be married to my daughter. No, she says, that was clever of you, Gerald. In other words, she knows he's been having an affair, and he knows that she knows. He knows that Sheila knows, but she can't prove it. But the arrival of the ring says, hey, I'm still going to marry you. You're still going to have this huge status in our patriarchal society. I reckon it's worth being married to me, even if I'm going to be unfaithful to you. And Mrs. Burling says, yes, that is an acceptable trade-off. Now, then we have how he reacts to the inspector. You couldn't have done anything else. He says to Burling, when Burling says to the inspector, look, I just had to sack Eva. She was a troublemaker, even though she was a great worker. You couldn't have done anything else. This, of course, is a lie. It's a lie that Eric wants to expose, that Sheila wants to expose, and the inspector wants to expose. But to Gerald, profit comes first, way before people, and this is how capitalist men exploit women. They are not treated as real people, they are treated as commodities. You buy them by hiring them, you get rid of them when they're no longer serving the purpose that you want. Next, we have the exposure of his affair with Daisy. Sheila works it out in advance of the inspector, and Gerald confesses it, but says, for God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector. In other words, his reputation in society is far more important to him than his relationship with his fiancée, his future wife. Where do women exist in the pecking order in this patriarchal society? Well below the interests of their husbands, even though Sheila represents the privileged classes just as Mrs. Burling does. They are still oppressed. They are still exploited. Sheila is young and she will not put up with this, and she breaks the engagement after the full details of his affair have been revealed. But what happens at the end? Stick around. Then he insults her further. Not only does he discount her feelings about his affair, and he says, now you want to see somebody else put through it, put through what you were put through. He has no real love for Sheila. He can't understand her feelings. He just imagines that she will react in the same way that he would. Tit for tat. This kind of tit for tat transactional relationship is what we're going to see in his affair with Daisy. He couldn't care less about the woman's feelings, and he couldn't care less about Sheila's feelings. And this is actually when she probably decides, rather than the affair itself, that she has to break off the engagement. Then we find out his motives in starting the affair with Daisy. He says it wasn't deliberate, but let's look at the evidence. The first thing he says about her is that she was very pretty. He's attracted simply to her looks, and he's attracted not because he's going to fall in love with somebody really pretty, which is superficial enough, but natural. He's going to exploit her because of her prettiness and her poverty. He contrasts her deliberately to those hard-eyed, dough-faced women who he normally sees in the palace bar. Why are they hard-eyed and dough-faced? Because they are prostitutes, forced by poverty into selling their bodies in order to earn a living. Who are they selling it to? People like Gerald. That, of course, is why Gerald is at the palace bar in the first place. He's looking to pay for sex. He really doesn't want to have to pay for the typical prostitute because she looks worn down by this life of prostitution. But who does he see? A young and very pretty girl. He decides to rescue her. But what does rescue mean? He looks for an opportunity. He takes her out. He realises that she's not eaten anything. Does he buy her food straight away? No, he does not. He gets her drunk by buying her drinks. What can we infer from this? He wants to lower her resistance to his seduction. He isn't going to be blatant and say how much for the night, because he can tell she's not used to a life of prostitution. Instead, he's going to put her up into this apartment that he happens to have. So let's examine that next. This apartment belongs to his friend. His friend has gone off to Canada for 6 months, and Gerald's language is, it happened that. Oh, it's like this stroke of luck. It happened that my friend had gone away and he just happened to give me the keys. That's not how it worked. His friends went away and said, look, here's the keys, 6 months, use my apartment. Well, what's Gerald going to use it for? Obviously, to have sex where people won't know about it, to install a mistress. He is on the lookout. That's why he goes to the palace bar, to find someone like Eva. When he finds her, he puts her up in the flat. How much is this costing him? 0 pennies, £0. Whereas those hard-eyed, dough-faced women, he'd have to pay. So not only is he getting someone young and very pretty, and not only is he getting to have sex with them, he's paying nothing. Now, when he breaks off, why does he break off? Well, it's because he's bored, but it's also because his friend is coming back. So to Gerald, it's a waste of money to pay for new accommodation for Daisy, Eva to live in. But he's bored of it now. He's had what he wants, he's exploited her, now he's getting rid of her. Sheila says, you must have felt like the wonderful fairy prince. She realises that he can sort of tell himself the story that I'm not exploiting this poor woman. I am, in fact, being a benefactor. I'm giving her a home that she wouldn't otherwise have had. I'm not directly telling her that she's got to have sex with me, but that is the implied relationship. I'm allowing her to fall in love with me, and do I return those feelings? No, of course I don't. Just like he didn't return Sheila's affections here. He just sees her as someone who wants to exploit him. Why? Because that's how he exploits other people, especially women. Next, once he's confessed, he doesn't hang around to hear how the inspector exposes the rest of the family. He makes up an excuse. He says, I'm rather more, then there's a pause, upset by this business than I appear to be. Now this language proves to us that it's a lie. He's not really sure what to say because he isn't upset. He couldn't care less about this dead girl. He pretends that he is because he wants to get out of the house. He can't even act because he doesn't appear to be upset. Look at the contrast between him and all the other members of the family. Even Burling is super upset and says he'll pay anything to have Eva back to life again. He feels guilty, but Gerald, nothing. No feeling at all. He pretends to be upset. Why? Because he smells a rat. He senses that no real inspector would behave like he does so assertively with so many accusations towards men of the class of Burling and Gerald. And so he goes out to investigate if the inspector is real. How else can we prove that? Well, he goes out and he says, I met a police sergeant I know down the road. First, he doesn't say where. The other thing is, police sergeants did not roam the beat. Constables roamed the beat. Police sergeants supervised. And then the third bit of evidence is, well, how does he know a police sergeant? How does a captain of industry get to know a police sergeant? What's going on there? They don't mix in the same social circles. They don't play golf together, do they? No. He knows a police sergeant because he is always doing things which are scandalous, which are perhaps beyond the law. That is the implication here. The law is on his side. It will turn a blind eye to the things he shouldn't do. So he deliberately goes looking for the police sergeant who says, no, we don't have an Inspector Gould, and therefore Gerald returns to expose the inspector as a fraud. But by being away, Priestley does something crucial. He only allows Gerald back into the play once the inspector has gone. And so he does not learn the inspector's lesson. The inspector is very clear about what he has tried to teach the Burlings. Not just that they were guilty in exploiting Eva so that she killed herself. He talks about how we are all members of one body. He says we are all responsible for each other. He talks about how Eva represents the millions and millions of Eva Smiths and John Smiths. And then, of course, he links it to that quote that we had in the thesis statement. There will be future war, fire and blood and anguish if you don't learn that lesson. Well, Gerald doesn't. He's not there for this teaching and he doesn't learn that lesson. Priestley is using him to show how the men who had power in the interwar periods between the First World War and the Second World War did not learn the lesson of the First World War. War made them richer, and that is why they didn't mind the Second World War coming along. Ka-ching. He comes back and he is very clever again. Remember the thing that Mrs. Burling pointed out about him. And so he proves to the Burlings that they all saw a different photograph, or could have done, so it might not have been the same girl. He proves that no one has died. He rings up the infirmary. But what is he trying to prove? Not that the inspector was a hoax, but that they can simply dismiss their actions. If the inspector is not real, there will be no consequences, there will be no scandal, and therefore they can carry on behaving as though they have done nothing wrong. And so he exists to directly oppose the inspector's lesson. He has learned nothing about responsibility, nothing about us being one body, and he certainly doesn't care about the millions of John Smiths and Eva Smiths, and he certainly doesn't care about the fire and blood and anguish, because that will lead to greater profits for his business. Well, now we come to the ending, and the most important part of the ending, whatever your question actually, but particularly here, everything's all right now, Sheila. What about this ring? In other words, now that there's going to be no scandal, you've got no reason not to marry me. Again, he is ignoring what has caused her to split. A, the affair, but B, the accusation that she is just as exploitative and cruel as he is. But does she reject him? Does she say no? She doesn't exactly. She says no, not yet. I must think, it's too soon. Well, what Priestley is saying is, look, Gerald is horrendous. I've just shown you how he's horrendous. But look what happened after Eva was with Gerald. She went with Eric. Look how much worse Eric was. Eric is the same social class as Gerald. And so when we get to the end, Sheila is thinking, Gerald's the best there is. Like, this whole generation of rich capitalist men are appalling. At least Gerald tries to be the fairy prince. At least he tries to be the good guy, even though he's the bad guy. But, you know, if I'm faced with someone who wants to be a fairy prince, rather than someone like Eric, who just acts on his instincts without proper barriers in behaviour, then she's thinking, well, I'm much better off with someone like Gerald than someone like Eric. What are these men in society like? Gerald's okay compared to the rest of them. And that's Priestley's point. The people who have power in 1945 are men like Gerald. This is why he wants his audience to vote for a socialist government, to change the future by rejecting this kind of male patriarchal society. And that is a profound message in 1945, because where are most of the men? They're still in the theatre of war. Who is largely in the audience? Older men, richer men who did not fight, but overwhelmingly women. These are the people he wants to reach. So he exposes the injustice of the men in the play in order to show women that now they have the vote. Unlike Sheila in 1912, 1945, all these women had the vote. They could all vote for a fairer, more socially responsible future. And of course, that is exactly what happens. So the message of the play is one that society at the time accepted. There you have your conclusion. The thesis statement will adapt to any single question. Why? Because those three ideas that Priestley had are the same ideas when he constructs all the other characters. His political message, his social message is exactly the same. Always write about the ending, no matter what the character is, because then we can link the inspector's words, fire and blood and anguish, to the consequences of the First World War and the Second World War. When you do that, top grades are assured. If you want to see how all those quotes link into an actual essay that you can steal for the exam, then check out my website, which is linked below. If, on the other hand, you think, no, Mr. Salles, there is no way I'm going to pay for one of these essay thingies, give me the prediction for the theme question. Well, all right, it's the theme question that's coming up next, I hope. But it might only be in 2 weeks' time. But anyway, it's coming.